Welcome back, everyone. Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're doing a deep dive, an objective media analysis looking at exactly how conservative commentators are framing the modern political battlefield. We're going to step back, look at the arguments, the rhetoric, and the numbers driving these highly polarized discussions. And just to be clear up front, we aren't taking sides here. We're simply decoding the precise narratives that are being broadcast to literally millions of viewers right now.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. First, the redistricting legal battles. Second, debating the billionaire class. Third, clashing views on history. Fourth, progressives versus moderates. And finally, looking ahead to elections.
All right, let's hit section 1. The redistricting legal battles. The fight for the map.
So look at the sheer volume of money on the screen right now. According to conservative sources, Democrats spent at least $53 million and possibly up to $100 million on redistricting efforts in Virginia alone. It's an absolutely massive investment, and commentators use this number to set the stage for what they call a colossal political miscalculation.
And the sources draw a really sharp contrast here. In Virginia, despite those millions spent, the state Supreme Court struck down the map in a super narrow 4-3 decision. But meanwhile, in states like Tennessee, Florida, and Texas, legislative maps were largely upheld. So conservative media frames the Virginia outcome as this unique, devastating anomaly for the left.
I mean, these commentators did not hold back. By highlighting claims that the left effectively lit a massive amount of money on fire in the midterms to achieve nothing, the sources are framing the Virginia decision as way more than just a legal loss. They're painting it as an incredibly costly, embarrassing blow to the Democrats' entire midterm strategy.
Moving right along to Section 2, debating the billionaire class, wealth and capitalism.
Now, conservative commentators repeatedly highlight this specific quote from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to really define the modern progressive stance, by stating that you can't genuinely earn $1 billion without breaking rules or maybe abusing labor. The sources argue that the progressive wing inherently demonizes the concentration of wealth. Figures like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. They say progressives view that level of success as just inherently unjust.
But to counter AOC's view, the sources point directly to this rebuttal from the Washington Post editorial board. They use this quote to basically frame the progressive argument as a fundamental lack of imagination about what can be achieved in a free society. The commentators argue that assuming extreme success requires cheating, well, that's just an arbitrary limitation on human potential and innovation.
And they back this up with an absolutely massive statistic. Conservative sources point out that the top 100 richest Americans are responsible for 4 to 5 million jobs. To put that into perspective, that is up to 15% of all private sector jobs in America. So they're framing these individuals as absolutely vital economic engines rather than drains on society.
All right, Section 3, clashing views on history, reframing the American story.
This historical tug-of-war is just fascinating. On the left, AOC claims the American Revolution was essentially a socialist uprising against concentrated wealth. But on the right, commentators push back fiercely. They insist the revolution was actually funded and led by wealthy capitalists. In fact, they eagerly point out that, adjusted for inflation, George Washington was the second richest president in history.
Now, looking at this timeline, conservative commentators point to a critical pivot in 1965. They argue that early American immigration was highly selective out of sheer necessity, just to settle the continent. But they claim that modern changes in policy dangerously coincided with the deindustrialization of America, which they say ultimately led to severe job scarcity for the working class.
And to truly grasp the conservative narrative here, we really have to look at how they explicitly define the progressive agenda. They label it socialism or full-blown communism. They frame it as this oppressive ideology that places the state above the individual, demonizes excellence, and actively punishes the builders of society, all in the name of forced fairness.
Which brings us to Section 4, Progressives versus Moderates, the internal democratic struggle.
So, who will successfully appeal to the working-class voter? This is literally the million-dollar question these sources are asking. As traditional, top-down, elite leadership gets rejected more and more by the base, both sides of the political aisle are scrambling. They're trying to figure out who can authentically capture the heart and the vote of the disenfranchised working class.
And according to the commentators, the progressive wing is currently winning this internal battle. They point out that progressives are actively winning local primaries, and these young politicians are really feeling the wind at their backs right now. The sources suggest this is mostly due to a base that is just completely rejecting establishment, top-down figures like Kamala Harris and opting instead for a very grassroots, lefty populist message.
It's really interesting how the sources heavily contrast AOC with Senator John Fetterman to highlight this party divide. On one side, they present AOC as a far-left, polarizing figure who's deeply entrenched in ideology, but on the other, they present Fetterman as this fascinating anomaly. Even though conservative commentators disagree with him on policy, they actually express a lot of respect for Fetterman. They describe him as someone who authentically stands by his working-class convictions, even when it means defying his own far-left base.
Now you might think, given all that, they'd want him to switch sides. And while some political strategists do suggest Fetterman should completely jump ship and join the Republicans, the commentators actually argue otherwise. They believe Fetterman is way more valuable staying a Democrat. Why? Because his presence constantly reminds the party of its traditional working-class roots. Basically, he keeps the party in line by exposing just how far left the rest of the base has shifted.
Let's head into our final stretch. Section 5, looking ahead to elections, polling and predictions.
Take a look at this Real Clear Politics polling data. It's staggering. There is a massive 27-point gap, with an overwhelming 61% of Americans feeling the country is on the wrong track. Sources use this to illustrate a deep national pessimism that they believe leaves the current administration highly vulnerable.
But wait, here's the massive paradox the commentators also highlight. Despite that 61% pessimism, the generic congressional ballot at the time of this polling actually favored Democrats by 6 points. So the crucial takeaway the sources are making is that despite overall dissatisfaction, Republicans still face a challenging uphill battle in the midterms. It just proves that national frustration doesn't automatically translate into conservative votes. Looking even further ahead to 2028, the conservative commentators are already assessing the Democratic bench. They note Kamala Harris often polls at the top, but is viewed as broadly unpopular. They describe AOC as a figure to be feared because of her ideology, but actually, they view Gavin Newsom as the most credible, formidable threat. Why is that? Well, because of his strategic, calculated appearances on conservative media. They see it as a clear signal that he's attempting to rebrand himself as a centrist. Ultimately, the overarching narrative across all the analyzed sources culminates in this exact dramatic framing: the fight for the survival of America. The commentators do not view this as standard political discourse, not at all. They frame the current landscape as a high-stakes, zero-sum battle for the very soul, identity, and survival of the nation.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. Based on the data, the history, and the really intense rhetoric we've unpacked today, what truly drives the American voter right now? As both parties battle for the working class, will tomorrow's elections be won by strategically pivoting to the center or by unapologetically embracing the extremes? Thanks for exploring this with us. Keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.